One of the biggest misunderstandings people have about avoidance is believing they do not feel pain when a relationship ends. People look at the silence, the distance, the lack of reaction, and they assume the avoidant simply never cared. But psychologically, that is not usually what is happening. The truth is more complicated and honestly more tragic. Avoidants are not people without emotions. They are people trained to disconnect from emotions because emotions once felt unsafe. Somewhere in their development, vulnerability became associated with disappointment, rejection, pressure, or loss of control. So instead of learning how to process emotional intensity, they learned how to escape it. They mastered detachment. They became experts at creating distance before anyone could hurt them deeply enough to expose the parts of themselves they worked so hard to protect. And this is why in the beginning, losing you may actually feel like relief to them. That sounds harsh, but it is psychologically accurate. The intimacy, the expectations, the emotional closeness, but even when they wanted it, activated fear inside them. Love created pressure. Connection created vulnerability. So when the relationship breaks or distance appears, their nervous system initially interprets it as safety. Finally, there is space again. Finally, there is control again. Finally, they can stop confronting emotions they never learned to regulate. But here's the part most people never see. Avoidants delay grief. While emotionally secure people feel the pain immediately, avoidants often experience emotional consequences later. Sometimes weeks later, sometimes months later. Because suppression is not healing. Silence is not peace. Detachment is not freedom. It is postponement. And eventually, postponed emotions collect interest. At first, they distract themselves. Work, entertainment, new people, endless stimulation. Anything to avoid sitting still long enough to feel what was actually lost. But human connection leaves psychological fingerprints. Real love changes your emotional system whether you admit it or not. The brain remembers safety. The body remembers consistency. The soul remembers presence. So eventually the silence becomes loud. The absence that once felt comfortable slowly becomes emptiness. The messages stop coming. The emotional reassurance disappears. The routines vanish. And for the first time, they are forced to experience the full weight of what your presence was actually doing in their life. Because people rarely appreciate emotional safety while they still have unlimited access to it. And this is where the avoidant mind enters conflict. They start replaying conversations they once dismissed. They remember moments they minimized. They begin questioning whether distance truly gave them freedom or simply loneliness disguised as independence. You have to understand something profound about human psychology. What we avoid does not disappear. It waits. Every ignored emotion waits. Every suppressed attachment waits. Every unspoken truth waits. Sooner or later, life creates silence loud enough for a person to hear themselves clearly. And when avoidants finally reach that silence, they often encounter the grief they thought they escaped. Not just grief over losing you, grief over their own inability to stay connected to something meaningful. That realization can shake a person deeply because now the pain is no longer about blame. It becomes about awareness. Awareness that they may have pushed away the very thing they were searching for. Awareness that their fear of vulnerability cost them intimacy. Awareness that running from emotional exposure also meant running from emotional fulfillment. And the hardest part? By the time avoidants fully feel the loss, the other person is often already healing. That is why emotional avoidance creates such painful irony. The person who looked unaffected in the beginning may eventually become the person haunted by the permanence of what they lost. Because in the end, silence does not protect you from loss. It only delays the moment you finally have to feel it. One of the most painful realizations an avoidant can experience happens long after the relationship ends. It is the moment they discover that genuine connection is not as replaceable as they once believed. In the beginning, many avoidants convince themselves they can move on quickly. They tell themselves there will always be another person, another opportunity, another connection waiting around the corner. And on the surface, modern life reinforces that illusion. Endless options, endless distractions, endless temporary attention. But human connection does not work like a marketplace. Real connection is not built on availability. It is built on emotional resonance. It is built on trust, safety, patience, understanding, and the rare experience of being fully seen by another human being without needing to perform or pretend. And the truth is, that kind of connection is extraordinarily rare. Avoidants often do not recognize the value of it while they are inside it, because closeness activates fear before it activates gratitude. The closer someone gets emotionally, the more exposed they feel. So instead of fully appreciating the relationship, part of their energy goes into managing discomfort. They focus on flaws. They search for reasons to create distance. They tell themselves they need more space, more independence, more certainty. But after the relationship ends, reality begins teaching them something their defenses tried to hide. Most connections are surface level. Most people will not have the patience you had. Most people will not try to understand them emotionally. Most people will not stay calm through their confusion, inconsistency, or withdrawal. Most people will not offer depth in a world addicted to performance. And eventually, comparison begins. Not always consciously at first. Sometimes it happens quietly. A conversation with someone new feels emotionally empty. A moment that should feel exciting feels strangely disconnected. They encounter attention without sincerity, attraction without safety, chemistry without peace. And slowly they begin measuring these experiences against the emotional depth they once had with you. That is when regret starts becoming real. Because now they are no longer comparing freedom to commitment. They are comparing loneliness to genuine connection. This is one of the deepest psychological contradictions inside avoidant behavior. They crave love but fear dependence. They want intimacy but resist vulnerability. They want connection but panic when it becomes emotionally real. And because of that conflict, they sometimes sabotage relationships that could have brought them the very fulfillment they were searching for. What they eventually discover is that emotional safety is not common. Being deeply understood is not common. Loyalty is not common. In fact, one of the rarest experiences in human life is meeting someone who consistently chooses understanding over ego, patience over control, and connection over games. When avoidants lose someone like that, the absence does not fully hit during the breakup itself. It hits during future experiences that fail to recreate what they lost. And this is where philosophy enters the conversation. Human beings often value things incorrectly because familiarity blinds us to significance. We assume what exists today will exist tomorrow. We mistake consistency for permanence. We overlook the extraordinary because it became emotionally accessible to us. But loss has a way of restoring perspective. Distance reveals value that comfort concealed. The avoidant eventually starts asking questions they avoided before. Why did peace feel uncomfortable to me? Why did I push away someone who genuinely cared? Why did temporary freedom feel more important than lasting connection? Why do superficial interactions now feel so empty? And those questions can become emotionally overwhelming because they force confrontation with a painful truth. Not every loss can be repaired. Sometimes the person you took for granted becomes the standard every future connection fails to reach. That realization changes people because once someone experiences the difference between attention and true emotional connection, they can never fully unsee it. They begin understanding that real love was never about intensity alone. It was about emotional safety, emotional consistency, emotional presence. And by the time avoidants finally understand the rarity of what they lost, they often realize something even heavier. You were not easy to replace because what you gave them was never ordinary. Some people lose relationships. Others lose the one connection that could have changed their life. One of the most transformative and painful moments for an avoidant happens when distraction disappears and they are finally left alone with themselves. Because while many people think avoidants are running from relationships, what they are often truly running from is self-confrontation. When you were in their life, your presence created emotional stability whether they acknowledged it or not. Your reassurance softened their anxiety. Your consistency gave structure to their emotional world. Even your effort to understand them protected them from fully facing their own internal chaos. And ironically, because you absorbed so much emotional weight, they could continue avoiding parts of themselves that needed healing. But once you are gone, that protective layer disappears. Now there is silence. Now there is distance. Now there is nobody buffering them from their own thoughts. And this is where something psychologically significant begins to happen. Human beings can avoid self-awareness for a surprisingly long time when they have distractions. Work, entertainment, social attention, casual relationships, routines, all of these can temporarily numb deeper emotional truths. But eventually the mind slows down enough for unresolved patterns to become visible. The avoidant starts noticing cycles. They begin realizing this was not just about one relationship. Similar endings may have happened before. The emotional withdrawal, the fear of closeness, the sudden need for distance once intimacy became real, the internal pressure that appeared whenever love demanded vulnerability instead of control. For the first time, they may stop seeing every failed connection as bad luck or incompatibility. They begin seeing their own participation in the destruction. And that realization is deeply uncomfortable because the human ego always prefers external blame over internal responsibility. It is easier to say they were too emotional than to ask, why does emotional closeness scare me so much? It is easier to criticize intimacy than to admit vulnerability feels terrifying. But growth begins where excuses end. And sometimes losing someone meaningful becomes the emotional shock powerful enough to force that growth into motion. Because now they cannot simply focus on your flaws. They are confronted with their own patterns. They remember moments where they shut down instead of communicating. Moments where they created distance instead of honesty. Moments where they withheld affection, avoided difficult conversations, or sabotaged connection the moment it became emotionally serious. This is why loss becomes a mirror. Not a mirror reflecting only what disappeared, but a mirror reflecting the unresolved fears they carried into the relationship itself. Fear of abandonment, fear of dependence, fear of losing control, fear of being truly seen. And the tragedy is that many avoidants spend years believing emotional independence makes them strong, while never realizing that true strength is the ability to remain emotionally present when vulnerability feels uncomfortable. That is the philosophical paradox at the center of avoidance. The walls built for protection eventually become prisons. The distance created to avoid pain eventually creates loneliness. And the emotional control they fought so hard to maintain slowly disconnects them from the very intimacy human beings are biologically wired to need. So when they lose you, they are not only grieving your absence, they are confronting themselves without distraction for perhaps the first time in years. And self-awareness can either break a person or transform them. Because eventually, every human being reaches a moment where they must decide, continue protecting the ego, or finally heal the wound beneath it. The hardest person to escape is the person you become when the silence finally tells the truth. One of the cruelest realities about human nature is that people often recognize value only after consistency disappears. While something is present every day, the mind adapts to it. What once felt extraordinary slowly becomes familiar, and familiarity can make people emotionally unconscious. This happens in relationships all the time, especially with avoidants, because they spend so much energy managing their discomfort with intimacy that they fail to fully absorb the quiet beauty of what is being given to them. At the time, the little things do not seem important. The good morning messages, the check-ins during stressful days, the patience during emotional shutdowns, the way you remember details they casually mentioned, the reassurance, the emotional availability, the calmness of simply knowing someone genuinely cared. None of these moments seem dramatic while they are happening. There is no cinematic music playing in the background, no giant emotional revelation. In fact, the most meaningful parts of love are often painfully ordinary. And because they are ordinary, they are easy to overlook. But psychologically, small repeated experiences shape emotional security far more than occasional grand gestures ever could. Human beings are creatures of emotional patterns. The nervous system learns safety through repetition. Consistency teaches trust. Presence teaches stability. Love is not built in one moment. It is built in thousands of quiet moments that slowly convince another person they are not alone in the world. And avoidants often underestimate this because emotional familiarity feels less stimulating than emotional distance. Chaos activates attention. Consistency feels subtle. So while they may intellectually know you care about them, they do not emotionally understand the magnitude of your value until your presence disappears. Then suddenly the small things become enormous. The phone becomes quieter. The day feels longer. Certain songs hit differently. Ordinary routines start carrying emotional emptiness. And what makes this experience so powerful is that memory does not prioritize perfection. It prioritizes emotional meaning. The avoidant begins remembering the tiny moments they once dismissed. The look on your face when you were trying to understand them, the way you supported them during difficult periods. The comfort of your presence after exhausting days. The emotional safety they quietly depended on without admitting it. This is where regret deepens, because they realized they were emotionally nourished by things they barely acknowledged while they still had them. And there is a philosophical truth hidden inside this experience that applies to all human beings. We often fail to recognize the significance of what quietly sustains us because it does not demand attention. Loud things capture the ego. Quiet things shape the soul. The deepest forms of love are rarely loud. They are consistent, patient, reliable, steady. And ironically, those are the exact qualities avoidants are most likely to take for granted because consistency feels emotionally safe. And emotionally safe things can become psychologically invisible until absence restores perspective. Loss has a brutal way of making invisible things visible. Now they understand what your loyalty actually meant. Now they understand the emotional labor you carried. Now they understand how much peace your presence created in their life. But understanding often arrives after opportunity has disappeared. And this is why some people spend years haunted not by dramatic endings, but by ordinary moments they once overlooked. Because eventually they realize those moments were never ordinary at all. They were evidence of love expressed in its purest form. In the end, people rarely miss the grand performance. They miss the person who quietly made life feel lighter every single day. There is a moment that affects avoidance more deeply than almost anything else, and it is not always the breakup itself. It is the moment they realize you are genuinely moving on, not reacting, not waiting, not emotionally orbiting around them anymore, truly moving forward with your life. Because as long as you remain emotionally attached, part of them unconsciously believes the connection is still accessible. Even from a distance, they feel a sense of psychological security knowing your energy is still available to them. Your attention, your care, your emotional presence, even if reduced, still exists within reach. And that creates an illusion of control. But healing changes the dynamic completely. The moment you stop chasing closure, the moment your emotional energy returns to yourself, the moment your life begins expanding beyond the pain, the avoidant feels something they spent years trying to avoid themselves, emotional shock. Because now the loss becomes real. Human beings often fail to fully value something while it remains emotionally obtainable. Availability creates assumption. We unconsciously believe there will always be more time, more opportunities, another conversation, another chance. But when someone emotionally detaches with clarity and self-respect, reality changes instantly. Scarcity creates awareness, and suddenly they begin seeing you differently. Not because you changed your worth overnight, but because your absence removed the illusion that your love would always be there regardless of their behavior. This is why growth becomes so powerful after heartbreak. Your healing forces them to confront consequences they previously avoided. They see you becoming stronger, more peaceful, more emotionally grounded. They notice that the person they expected to remain wounded is rebuilding a life without them. And psychologically, that creates cognitive dissonance, because avoidants often expect distance to preserve emotional safety while keeping attachment available in the background. They want freedom from emotional pressure without fully losing connection. But when you genuinely let go, they are forced to experience finality. And finality activates reflection. Now they replay memories differently. Now they question decisions differently. Now they wonder whether fear costs them something irreplaceable. And perhaps the hardest realization of all is recognizing that your departure was not caused by a lack of love. It was caused by emotional exhaustion. You did not leave because you stopped caring. You left because connection cannot survive indefinitely without reciprocity, emotional presence, and vulnerability. That realization carries weight because it removes the comforting fantasy that you were simply incompatible. Instead, they must face the possibility that they were loved deeply and still failed to protect the relationship. And there is a deeper philosophical principle here that extends beyond romantic relationships. People do not transform when they are merely told the truth. They transform when they experience consequences emotionally. Pain creates awareness where comfort often cannot. Watching you evolve without them becomes undeniable evidence that life continued after the relationship ended, but not in the way they expected. Instead of collapsing permanently, you adapted. You grew, you rediscovered your identity beyond the connection. And your resilience becomes a mirror reflecting the emotional work they avoided within themselves. That is when regret becomes heavier than pride, because now they understand something too late. Your loyalty was never weakness. Your patience was never dependency. And your love was never guaranteed forever. Sometimes the greatest wake-up call is realizing the person you thought would always be there finally learned how to live without you. For some avoidants, the pain of losing someone meaningful becomes more than heartbreak. It becomes a turning point. Not because suffering magically transforms people, but because pain has a unique ability to destroy illusions. And avoidants, perhaps more than most people, live behind emotional illusions for years. The illusion that independence means never needing anyone. The illusion that vulnerability is weakness. The illusion that emotional distance protects them from suffering. The illusion that avoiding attachment gives them control. But eventually life reveals a difficult truth. Avoiding pain also means avoiding depth, intimacy, and genuine human connection. You cannot selectively numb emotions. When people disconnect from vulnerability, they also disconnect from the richness that makes relationships meaningful. And sometimes losing the right person forces that realization into the open. Not immediately, of course. Growth rarely begins in clarity. It usually begins in discomfort, confusion, restlessness, regret. The avoidant starts noticing that the strategies they once used to feel safe are no longer working. Distraction feels temporary. Surface-level connections feel empty. Emotional detachment no longer feels empowering. It feels isolating. And this creates the beginning of self-awareness, because eventually they are forced to ask themselves a question they spent years avoiding. What if the problem was never intimacy itself, but my fear of it? That question can change a person's life. For the first time, they begin understanding that love was never the enemy. Vulnerability was not the threat. Emotional closeness was not the prison they imagined it to be. The real prison was fear. Fear of abandonment, fear of dependence, fear of losing control, fear of being fully seen and possibly rejected anyway. And here is what makes this realization so profound. Avoidants often believe they are protecting themselves from pain while never recognizing they are also protecting themselves from love. That is the paradox. The walls that kept danger out also kept connection out. The emotional distance that created safety also created loneliness. The control they fought so hard to maintain slowly disconnected them from their own emotional lives. But pain has a way of forcing honesty, especially the pain of losing someone who genuinely mattered. Now they begin reevaluating everything differently. They start recognizing moments where they should have communicated instead of withdrawing. Moments where they should have softened instead of becoming defensive. Moments where they should have stayed emotionally present instead of escaping into distance. And for some people, this awareness becomes the beginning of transformation. Not performative change, not temporary regret, real inner work. Because true growth begins the moment a person stops asking, "Who hurt me?" and starts asking, "How have my wounds shaped the way I love?" That level of self-confrontation is difficult. It requires humility, responsibility, emotional courage. It means admitting that survival mechanisms developed in the past may now be sabotaging the future. But this is also where healing becomes possible. Because once someone becomes conscious of their patterns, they are no longer completely controlled by them. Awareness creates choice, and choice creates the possibility of change. Still, there is one final truth many avoidants eventually learn. Growth does not guarantee restored opportunities. Sometimes the lesson arrives after the loss has become permanent. Sometimes the person who inspired the transformation is no longer there to witness it. And that reality can stay with someone forever. Because life has a strange way of teaching human beings the value of love only after they discover what life feels like without it. In the end, the greatest pain is not losing someone. It is realizing you lost them because you were afraid to fully love while you still had the chance. In the end, what this entire story really comes down to is not avoidance, not labels, not psychological types, but the human condition itself. The struggle between fear and love, between protection and connection, between control and vulnerability, because every avoidant pattern at its core is not about not feeling. It is about feeling too much without knowing how to hold it. And every person who loved them deeply was not just a partner in their life, but a mirror reflecting what emotional safety could have looked like if fear had not stepped in first. But life does not wait for perfect timing. It does not pause while people figure themselves out at the expense of others. It moves, it evolves, and so do people. And this is where the real lesson lands, because loss has a strange intelligence to it. It teaches what comfort never could. It forces clarity where avoidance once lived, and it reveals value only after silence replaces presence. For the avoidant, the realization often comes late, not because they didn't care, but because they learned to care in the wrong direction, away from vulnerability instead of into it, away from emotional risk instead of through it. And for the one who loved them, the journey is equally transformative. Because at some point, love stops being about proving worth to someone who cannot receive it and becomes about recognizing your own value without external validation. It becomes about choosing emotional reciprocity over emotional uncertainty. It becomes about understanding that real love does not require you to shrink, chase, or wait endlessly for someone to become ready. The truth is simple, even if it is not easy. You cannot force someone to be emotionally available. You cannot heal someone by overextending yourself. And you cannot turn fear into love by loving harder. At some point, love has to be met with presence. Otherwise, it becomes self-abandonment disguised as loyalty. And that is where everything changes. Because when you finally step out of that cycle, something powerful happens. Not just in your life, but in how others perceive you. Your absence becomes a mirror. Your boundaries become clarity. Your healing becomes a statement that you are no longer available for half connection, confusion, or emotional inconsistency. And in that space, whether someone returns or not, the outcome is no longer the point. The point is you do not lose yourself trying to be chosen. So the final truth is this. Sometimes losing you becomes the lesson they needed to grow, but choosing yourself becomes the breakthrough you needed to live.